Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into a piece of history that many people either don't know or have forgotten, a chapter that could have changed the future of South Asia in ways we can only imagine. We are talking about Pakistan versus India and the so-called forgotten showdown of 1957. While most of us remember the wars of 1947, 1965, 1971, and of course the Kargil conflict of 1999, the year 1957 often goes unnoticed in mainstream discussions. Yet it was a moment where tensions were at a boiling point and both nations stood on the brink of escalation just a decade after partition. When the subcontinent was divided in 1947, the wounds of partition were still fresh. Millions had crossed borders, hundreds of thousands had lost their lives, and both India and Pakistan were still finding their footing as independent states. Kashmir had already become the main point of contention, with the First War of 1947-48 ending in a ceasefire brokered by the United Nations. But the issue was far from resolved. By 1957, Kashmir was once again at the heart of the storm. India had declared Jammu and Kashmir as an integral part of its union, formally integrating it, while Pakistan strongly rejected this move and declared it illegal. This development brought the two nations dangerously close to another conflict, one that many historians call the forgotten showdown. Pakistan at this time was still under civilian leadership, but military influence was growing rapidly. The army was becoming more powerful, and by the late 1950s it would take over the country altogether. India, under Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, was pursuing a policy of non-alignment during the Cold War, but at the same time was determined to keep Kashmir firmly within its borders. In 1957, the Constituent Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir ratified the state's accession to India. For Pakistan, this was seen as a betrayal of earlier United Nations resolutions that promised a plebiscite to let the people of Kashmir decide their future. Pakistan's anger grew, and many within the government and military began pushing for a more aggressive response. While no full-scale war erupted in 1957, the tensions were so high that both sides increased military readiness. There were reports of troop movements, skirmishes across the line of control, and heated exchanges at the diplomatic level. The showdown remained more political and psychological than an actual battlefield clash, but it was a turning point. It reinforced the idea in Pakistan that diplomacy alone would not solve the Kashmir dispute. On the other side, India interpreted its position as validated and strengthened its resolve to hold on to Kashmir at all costs. The international situation in 1957 also shaped this near crisis. The Cold War was in full swing, and both the United States and the Soviet Union had interests in the subcontinent. Pakistan had joined Western alliances like SEATO and CENTO, tying itself closer to Washington, while India leaned more towards Moscow despite its official stance of non-alignment. The global powers were cautious about another war in South Asia because it could open a dangerous front in their competition. This outside pressure played a big role in preventing a direct clash that year, even as both nations stood firm in their positions. Inside Pakistan, the memory of the First War over Kashmir and the anger over India's 1957 declaration hardened the belief that a military solution was inevitable. This thinking would later contribute to the planning for Operation Gibraltar and the 1965 war. In India, Nehru used the 1957 developments to assert India's sovereignty over Kashmir more firmly, which became an official policy direction. What we see here is that even though 1957 is not remembered as a war year, it shaped the thinking and policies that defined the conflicts that followed. Another important aspect often overlooked is the role of the Kashmiri people themselves during this period. In 1957, many Kashmiris felt betrayed because the promised plebiscite under UN supervision never happened. Protests, strikes, and unrest spread in the valley, adding pressure on both Pakistan and India. Pakistan saw this as proof that Kashmiris wanted independence or accession to Pakistan, while India downplayed these movements as local disturbances. The voices of Kashmiris were largely ignored in the larger geopolitical game, yet their resistance in that period became a foundation for decades of unrest that continue to this day. If we take a step back and look at the broader picture, the forgotten Showdown of 1957 illustrates a few important truths about India-Pakistan relations. First, it shows how fragile the peace was, even a decade after independence. The bitterness of partition had not faded, and Kashmir ensured that hostility remained alive. Second, it shows how global Cold War politics intersected with local disputes, often preventing wars from breaking out but never really solving the core issues. Third, it shows how unresolved disputes fester over time, leading to repeated cycles of confrontation. This forgotten chapter also raises an interesting question. What if the tensions in 1957 had escalated into a full-scale war? Both countries were still young and not militarily as strong as they would become later. A war at that stage could have weakened them severely, perhaps even changed their political paths. It is possible that Pakistan's military would have taken power earlier, or that India's policy of non-alignment would have been compromised. But since the crisis never escalated to open war, both nations continued to grow, only to collide later with even greater force. One of the reasons why 1957 is not widely remembered is because it lacks the dramatic battlefield stories of later wars. There were no major territorial changes, no heroic battles to be told in school textbooks, and no grand declarations of victory. Instead, it was a year of hidden threats, strong words, military posturing, and political maneuvers. Yet, as any historian will tell you, sometimes the events that don't happen are just as important as those that do. The absence of a war in 1957 doesn't mean the moment was unimportant. On the contrary, it reveals the depth of the mistrust and the inevitability of future wars. For students of history and anyone interested in South Asian politics, the 1957 Showdown is a reminder of how close the region has come to conflict time and time again. It also highlights how every action taken in Kashmir echoes far beyond the valley, shaping the destinies of two nuclear-armed nations. What was decided in 1957, or rather what was not resolved, continues to cast a shadow over South Asia even today. The people of Pakistan and India continue to live with the consequences of decisions and confrontations from decades ago, and Kashmir remains at the center of this unresolved story. In conclusion, while 1957 may not be celebrated or memorialized in the same way as other wars between India and Pakistan, it deserves recognition as a turning point. It was a year that hardened attitudes, deepened divisions, and set the stage for conflicts yet to come. To call it forgotten is accurate, but to ignore it would be a mistake. For those who wish to understand why peace between India and Pakistan remains elusive, and why Kashmir remains one of the world's most dangerous flashpoints, looking back at 1957 is essential. That was our deep dive into Pakistan versus India, the forgotten 1957 Showdown. A chapter of history that did not erupt into war but carried all the elements of one. It reminds us that history is not only about the battles fought, but also about the battles avoided and the tensions that simmer just beneath the surface. If you found this exploration informative, make sure to stay tuned for more untold stories of history that continue to shape our present.